Today we're going to be talking about the 1980s in U.S. history, specifically the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Now, the election of 1980 was not close at all. People thought it was going to be, but it ended up being a landslide and not for the incumbent. So Jimmy Carter was president at this time. He was running for re-election, and yet he was quite unpopular due to the bad economy and the continuing Iran hostage crisis. He was unpopular even in his own party, and that's why Senator Ted Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's younger brother, actually challenged him for the Democratic nomination. Now, due to a series of past scandals, including the Chappaquiddick scandal from 1969, in which Ted Kennedy unintentionally killed somebody while drunk driving, Kennedy could not gain enough support, and Carter was re-nominated. The Republican nominee, Ronald Reagan, had been a movie star for a number of years, and he had also been the governor of California for 8 years. He was very charismatic, very optimistic, and one thing that Reagan asked voters in his debate with Jimmy Carter was, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go to the grocery store now and fill up your gas tank in your car, or is it harder now? Are you worse off now?" And that question really resonated with voters, and to most people, the answer was no. They were worse off than they were 4 years ago. And because of that, Reagan was able to defeat Carter, winning 44 states, and Carter accepted defeat very graciously. He believed that people had not turned against him personally, but had voted their frustrations in lost dominance in economic affairs and lost preeminence in global affairs, and he understood. Now, the hour that Ronald Reagan became president, on January 20th, 1981, the 52 American hostages that had been held in Iran for 444 days were released. So, pretty good start to a presidency. This was done for two reasons. Number one, because the Iranians were afraid of what Reagan might do to get the hostages freed, some sort of aggressive military action, but also because the Iranians hated Jimmy Carter and didn't want to give him any credit for freeing the hostages. Now, Reagan immediately went to work trying to fix the economy and trying to regain American superiority in global affairs, specifically in the context of the Cold War. Now, he cut taxes, he cut regulations for businesses according to the theory of supply-side economics, and this was dubbed Reaganomics. And essentially what this meant was get the government less and less involved in businesses, cut taxes, cut regulations, so that businesses can create more and can hire more people and keep more of the money that they make. As a result, by 1983, it took 2 years to start churning. By 1983, the economy was booming again, and it remained booming really for the next 25 years. It wasn't until the Great Recession of 2008 that the economy took a sharp turn in the other direction. Unemployment and inflation went down over the course of his presidency. Poverty decreased. However, income inequality increased. So while by the end of his presidency, everyone was better off economically, the rich were much, much better off economically, whereas the poor were a little better off economically. So the fact that it was disproportionate bothered some, but the fact that everyone was less poor also kind of gave the other side kind of ammunition to say, well, at least it's good for everybody, it's just more good for the rich than for the poor. Reagan also sparked a surge in patriotism. He kind of made it cool to be patriotic again, and he sparked a renewed vigor to win the Cold War. People thought it was possible again to win the Cold War and that we weren't destined to be a second-rate power forever. Now, the economic improvement was especially felt in minority communities. For example, the black unemployment rate went from a whopping 21% when he took office to 13% by the time that Reagan had left office. Now, Reagan was against affirmative action, especially racial quotas. One quote he said is that quotas deny jobs to many who would have gotten them otherwise, but who weren't born a specified race or sex. That's discrimination, pure and simple, and is exactly what the civil rights laws were designed to stop. Quotas also cast a shadow on the real achievements of minorities, which makes quotas a double tragedy. He was very committed to preventing discrimination against any and all Americans, including against whites. Now, some people condemned Reagan as a racist for his opposition to affirmative action. But others claimed that his position showed not racism, but showed his high regard for black people and their potential, as well as his commitment to ensure the equality of all Americans, not just some. Now, in 1983, Reagan made Martin Luther King Jr. Day a national holiday. In his commencement speech, he said, "This year marks the first observance of the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a national holiday. It is a time for rejoicing and reflecting. We rejoice because in his short life, Dr. King, by his preaching, his example, and his leadership, helped to move us closer to the ideals on which America was founded." Now, one thing that really ravaged the world, especially Africa, but to a lesser extent America in the 1980s, was AIDS. In 1981, this new disease emerged called acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS. Now, this was caused by human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. And HIV weakens the immune system so that people more easily succumb to other illnesses. So it's usually HIV combined with AIDS that kills somebody. And the virus is contracted through the exchange of bodily fluids, usually through unprotected sex, most commonly through homosexual contact between men. And another way that it's spread is through the sharing of intravenous needles. Now, 70% of American cases were among gay men, and 40% of all diagnoses in the U.S. were among African Americans, despite there being only 13% of the population. Now, people disagreed about how this disease should be combated. Some encouraged abstinence and sexual morality and said that, these are the consequences of sexual immorality. We should stay pure, we should wait till marriage to have sex, etc. And then others said, no, you shouldn't tell people how to live. We just need more government funding to find a cure, try to find a vaccine, and not lecture people on how to live their lives. And you had a lot of hysteria ensuing. A lot of times when a legitimate crisis happens, like AIDS, people actually were dying from AIDS, but it was also preventable for most people. Nonetheless, you have hysteria ensuing, and you have these myths coming about that anyone can get AIDS. It doesn't matter if you're a virgin and never did intravenous drugs. Like, no matter what, anyone can get AIDS. And that wasn't really accurate. You had an extremely low chance to get AIDS unless you were participating in certain behaviors. But hysteria very much ensued. I mean, people panicked. We didn't know too much about the illness at this time. One example of hysteria was that in 1987, Oprah Winfrey said that 1 in 5 heterosexuals would be dead by 1990, which of course did not happen. Now, AIDS was extremely bad in Africa. Millions of people died in Africa because there weren't preventative measures like condoms, and there weren't antiretroviral drugs, treatment methods that we had here in America. So it just completely ravaged Africa, really until the 2000s. You also have some strides in medicine in the 1980s. Ben Carson, he was a graduate of Yale University and the University of Michigan Medical School. He was a brain surgeon. He was the director of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital for 20 years. And in 1987, Dr. Carson accomplished something that no other doctor had ever done. He separated conjoined twins at the head. He and his team of 70 surgeons at Johns Hopkins, they conducted a 22-hour operation, didn't take a single break, didn't sit down, and it was successful. He said that the night before the surgery, he prayed for God's guidance and wisdom during the operation. Another famous doctor, Anthony Fauci, who became more famous during the COVID epidemic, worked to try to create an AIDS vaccine. It was never developed. However, the introduction of antiretroviral drugs made huge strides in decreasing AIDS death, especially by the mid-90s. AIDS deaths had gone way down. Colin Powell was a major military leader in the 1980s, 1990s, and even 2000s. He was the son of Jamaican immigrants. He served in the Vietnam War. He had become a 4-star general, and he won countless medals, including the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. In 1987, Ronald Reagan appointed him to be National Security Advisor, making him the first African American to hold that position. Then in 1989, President George H.W. Bush appointed him to be the first black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which are military advisors. He served during the very successful Persian Gulf War, which we'll get to in the next lecture. He would then go on to be the first black Secretary of State under George W. Bush in 2001. So he broke barriers pretty much his whole life. In 1982, the United States supported the UK in the Falklands War. This was an effort to take back the Falkland Islands, which are in the South Atlantic. The fascist Argentinian government had taken over the Falkland Islands, which had belonged to the British. And the British, under the leadership of Margaret Thatcher, led a military campaign to take back the Falklands, and it was very successful. Then in 1983, the U.S. intervened militarily on the Caribbean island of Grenada. Very small island, but the reason we intervened was to overthrow a communist government that had been backed by Cuba, that had taken over Grenada. We still were in the midst of the Cold War. We did not want any other nations to fall to communism because we knew what communist governments did to their people. This war was caused in part by the fact that 600 Americans were on the island of Grenada when it fell to the Marxist government, and Reagan feared that another hostage crisis would take place if the Marxist government was allowed to remain in power. So the U.S. Invaded Grenada, and after just 4 days of fighting and 88 deaths, the U.S. was able to win this brief war, and the Marxist government was deposed. Now, throughout the 1980s, there was also a guerrilla group called the Contras who were fighting against their Marxist government called the Sandinista in Nicaragua. Now, in 1986, during the Iran-Iraq War, Iran and Iraq fought a deadly war throughout the 1980s, and during this war, several members of Reagan's staff sold weapons to Iran. Now, that's pretty controversial because Iran is not a safe country. Remember, they had a revolution in 1979, had become an Islamic state, and hated America. So giving weapons to a dangerous country was seen as irresponsible. But not only that, but then the money that Reagan's staff got from selling weapons to Iran was then used to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, the anti-communist guerrilla group that was trying to overthrow the Marxist government in Nicaragua. So this was done in order to aid the Cold War struggle against communism. We had gotten involved in proxy wars all over the world, so this was not seen as any different. Reagan's staff was also hoping to secure the release of 7 U.S. hostages in Lebanon with this deal. Iran was and is the largest state sponsor of international terrorism, and one of the groups they support is Hezbollah in Lebanon, and you had several hostages, American hostages, being held in Lebanon that we were hoping to release. However, the funding of the Contras specifically had been prohibited by Congress. Congress had voted that we were not going to get involved in the Contra War in Nicaragua. Therefore, when Reagan staff members gave funds to the Contras in Nicaragua, that was technically breaking the law. And also, as I said, supplying an enemy like Iran with weapons was seen as threatening to our national security. There is also the idea that we don't negotiate with terrorists. So the idea that we gave money to a terrorist nation in order to secure the release of hostages was very taboo. Now, when this action was revealed, Reagan went on air. He told the American people that there, in fact, had been no exchange of arms for hostages, but then after an investigation, it was revealed that, in fact, there had been, but Reagan had not known about it. He then apologized to the public on behalf of his administration. He said, "I should have kept a better eye on my staff, didn't know this was happening," and 11 of his staff members were fired and then subsequently convicted. Now, Oliver North was the person who took most of the fall for this scandal, which became known as the IranContra scandal. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Marines. He was a member of Reagan's National Security Council, and he was the one who had diverted the money from Iran to fund the Contras. He was convicted on felony conspiracy charges, but this ruling was reversed after appeal. Now, throughout the Iran-Contra affair, people thought that this was going to be the next Watergate. This is going to be the next scandal that takes down a president. However, Reagan had learned from Nixon's mistakes. He didn't try to cover anything up. He didn't, try to save certain members of his staff and lie about what they did. Once he learned the truth, he faced the scandal head on. He was honest and apologetic to the American people and quickly admitted his mistakes. And this is why the scandal did not destroy his presidency, like the Watergate scandal destroyed Nixon's presidency. So this entire era of the 1980s is sometimes called the Reagan Revolution because of all the changes that took place, both in economic affairs and in foreign policy. Things had shifted sharply to the right. You had a global rise of conservatism taking place at this time. This led to more free market, capitalistic leaders taking power all over the world. One place where this happened was the UK. You have Margaret Thatcher being elected as the first female prime minister of the UK in 1979 and remained so until 1990. She was prime minister for 11 years. So throughout the entire time that Reagan was president and then some, she was the prime minister of the UK. She was very similar to Reagan in her conservative economic, military, and social policies. She was staunchly anti-communist. She supported efforts to defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War. In fact, she was so harsh on the Soviets that they came up with a nickname for her, the Iron Lady, because she could not be moved. Thatcher was also the longest-serving prime minister of the 20th century. You have another ally in the 1980s in the more conservative shift in global politics and the efforts to win the Cold War, and that was Pope John Paul II. He was the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church from 1978 through 2005. He was from Poland and had lived through both the Nazi and the Soviet occupations of his country, so he understood the evils of both fascism and communism firsthand. So when he became Pope, he became a huge advocate for Eastern Europe, which was still under Soviet control at this time. He, like Reagan and Thatcher, preached against communism and for freedom. And his big message for people was, do not fear. So he, along with Reagan and Thatcher and several other global leaders, helped to eventually free Eastern Europe and collapse the Soviet Union, which we'll get to later. Now, in 1981, you actually have two assassination attempts taking place within 6 weeks of each other that almost ended the lives both of President Reagan and Pope John Paul II. On March 30th, 1981, which was just 2 months after Reagan took office, Reagan was shot in the chest by a deranged man who was trying to impress an actress. The bullet punctured one of Reagan's lungs and lodged less than an inch from his heart. If it had traveled 1 more inch, Reagan would have died. But he didn't. He was rushed to George Washington University Hospital. The doctors were able to save his life. And this was really transformative here. The fact that he survived was a really big deal, because if he had died, then all of the accomplishments of his 8 years as president, the winning of the Cold War, the transformation of the American economy, none of that would have happened. But then 6 weeks later, on May 13th, 1981, Pope John Paul II was shot as well. He was shot by a Turkish assassin who had actually been hired by the Bulgarian Communist Party. And the Bulgarian communists had been directed by the Soviet Union, the KGB, to kill the Pope because the Pope was very anti-communist and the Soviets saw him as a threat. John Paul also survived. And in fact, the next year, in 1982, when he and Reagan first met, they spoke about their belief in a divine plan and that God had spared their lives for the purpose of taking down communism in Europe and liberating a continent. They remained very close friends, and their efforts at liberating Europe would eventually succeed. Now, in 1983, in a speech to Christian leaders, Reagan called the USSR an evil empire. And this angered Soviet leaders, but it was true. I mean, you have the gulags, which were their system of concentration camps in which millions of people suffered. You had genocides taking place in the Soviet Union, including the Ukrainian massacre in the 1930s that killed millions. You have mass oppression. I mean, people are living hellish lives, and the Soviet Union was an evil empire. However, it was not seen as politically correct or polite to say so, and so a lot of people said, Reagan is a warmonger. He's going to start World War III with the Soviets. But with this phrase, Reagan was trying to communicate the moral imperative of winning the Cold War. He wanted to make it clear that that both sides were not equally to blame. At this time, you had a lot of efforts to kind of say that, oh, yeah, this Cold War thing, it's just a big misunderstanding. The Soviets and the Americans are equally to blame. We should just, try to decrease tensions and live peaceably with them. But Reagan said, no, we can't allow the Soviets to continue all of their human rights abuses, their crimes against humanity. It's inhumane to allow them to do so, just to be polite. And he was trying to communicate to Americans that the struggle against communism was not merely a misunderstanding, but rather an extension of the age-old struggle of good versus evil. So this hardline stance against the Soviet Union caused a second arms race to develop. You have both the Soviets and the Americans ramping up their number of nuclear weapons and their conventional military, and fears of a nuclear war started to resurface again. Also in 1983, the USSR blasted a civilian airplane out of the sky. You have an airline, Korean Airline 007, that was carrying 270 innocent civilians, and the Soviets just blasted it out of the sky because it veered off their course into their airspace. Reagan condemned this as the Korean Airline massacre because the Soviets were already starting to deny it, and then they said it was a mistake and all sorts of other lies. But he condemned this as further evidence that communism needed to be not just tolerated, not just appeased or contained, but it needed to be destroyed. It needed to be relegated to the ash heap of history. Now, with the economy booming again and American global prestige on the rise, Reagan ran for re-election. Now, at this point, he was already the oldest president we had ever had. He was 72 or 73 at this time. And his famous campaign ad claimed it was morning again in America, essentially saying age in this case doesn't matter, but mental clarity does. And he, at least at this point, had not started to slip in his mental faculties. And his campaign ads were very positive, saying that things have transformed in America, things had become much better, let's not go back to where we were 4 years ago. So he was 73 years old. And this became one of the defining issues in his debates against his Democratic opponent, who was Jimmy Carter's former vice president, Walter Mondale. Reagan won in a 49-state landslide. The only state that voted for Walter Mondale was his home state of Minnesota, so this ensured Reagan 4 more years to accomplish his Cold War goals. Well, during Reagan's first term, he dealt with 3 different Soviet leaders, Leonid Brezhnev, Yuri Andropov, and Konstantin Chernenko. All of these men were staunch Marxists who stubbornly refused to negotiate whatsoever with Ronald Reagan. Now, in 1985, you have a more moderate, younger leader coming to power in the Soviet Union named Mikhail Gorbachev, and he was completely different from his predecessors. He was not an evil man like most of the Soviet leaders had been. He was a communist, but at the same time, he wanted to reform communism. He wanted to make the Soviet Union more free, more fair for all. And he had the intention of easing tensions with the U.S., caused by the Cold War. So finally, Reagan said, I have someone I can talk to, someone I can work with. Let's get this done. Gorbachev introduced perestroika, which was his effort to reform the Soviet economy to compete in a free market global economy, and this lifted millions of people out of poverty. He then introduced glasnost, which was an attempt to bring an openness to Soviet society, try to bring more freedom to Soviet citizens. Meanwhile, Reagan had introduced the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, and this was his plan to develop technological systems that could intercept Soviet missiles before they would reach the U.S., just shoot them out of the sky so that they wouldn't harm anyone when they landed. Critics just dubbed this Star Wars because they thought this was just science fiction, and indeed it was never fully developed, but the fact that we were working on that, even though it was costing a lot of money, even though it was never fully developed, it was still very effective because it scared the Soviet Union. I mean, after all, if we have technological systems that can shoot down their nuclear missiles, then it would be like they don't have any nuclear missiles, and we do, which would mean in theory that we could bomb them with impunity, with no consequences, and that made them very, very scared. So the Soviets bankrupted themselves trying to keep up, trying to develop something similar, and it also scared them to the point where it brought them to the negotiating table, and they wanted to end the Cold War because they were afraid about what a war with Reagan would be like. So Reagan and Gorbachev began to communicate. They developed a very good relationship, and this improved U.S.-Soviet relations. They met 5 times from 1985 to 1988. They met in Geneva, Switzerland for the first time, then in Reykjavik, Iceland. Then Gorbachev came to Washington, D.C. Then Reagan went to Moscow, and then they both met in New York at the very end of Reagan's presidency. Now, Reagan refused to dismantle SDI. Gorbachev insisted on that, but Reagan refused. However, they agreed to the 1987 INF Treaty. This stands for Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. And this decreased each nation's nuclear arsenal by over 1,000 missiles, making nuclear war, much less likely. In 1987, Reagan visited West Berlin. Remember, Berlin has the Berlin Wall at this time. It had been put up in 1961, and people had been trapped inside East Germany ever since. And when Reagan visited West Berlin, he made a speech at the Brandenburg Gate of the Berlin Wall. And in this speech, he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, I know you're a good man. We've met many times, and you say you seek peace, and so do I. So, Mr. Gorbachev, if you truly seek peace, come to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And these 4 words became the defining words of the Reagan presidency because it was a turning point. It led to the eventual demolition of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which we'll get to in our next lecture. Now, on January 28th, 1986, you have another disaster taking place. You have the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. So space shuttles had replaced just regular rockets. Space shuttles were essentially airplanes that could be flown in space and docked at the International Space Center. And when this space shuttle launched, just about 45 seconds after it launched, it exploded. And this killed all 7 astronauts on board, including the woman who would have been the first civilian in space, Krista McAuliffe. Reagan had come up with this idea to put a civilian in space, and he said he wanted it to be among the best of American civilians, and so he said, we're going to pick a teacher. And so you have this national contest where over 10,000 public school teachers filled out applications wanting to be that one, wanting to be that astronaut chosen to go up into space. And Krista McAuliffe, who was a high school history teacher from New Hampshire, she was chosen. Now, tragically, she died that day, as did the other victims, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Richard Scobie, and Gregory Jarvis. Now, this national tragedy was the first time that NASA had ever lost someone in the air. Reagan canceled that night's State of the Union address, which had been planned for weeks, and instead he gave a brief address to the mourning nation about the tragedy. He concluded the speech, "The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." He was called the great communicator because of his knack for really reaching the emotions and the intellect of America. Even Democrats kind of liked him because he was a likable person. He was obviously a very capable president. Even though he was more conservative than what a lot of people would have liked, he was still very effective and very good-natured as well. Now, some other components of his legacy for this final slide here. Reagan was vocally and unapologetically pro-life. He was against the Roe v. Wade decision and spoke about the importance and the sanctity of honoring human life. He spoke very often about this, about the sanctity of human life at every stage, from the womb to the tomb. However, of the 3 Supreme Court justices that he nominated, 2 of them turned out to be pro-choice. Now, it's likely he didn't know that at the time. A lot of times judges don't have public views about issues like that, and we don't really know until they judge on these matters. But 2 of his Supreme Court nominees voted to uphold Roe v. Wade in the 1992 decision Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Now, this tragically prolonged Roe v. Wade's life for 30 more years until finally in 2022 it was overturned. Reagan did appoint the first female Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. Before that, every Supreme Court Justice for the 200-year history of our nation had been male, and since then we've had several more females on the bench. Reagan also made amends with victims of the Japanese-American internment during World War II. He did this by signing the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, and this gave $20,000 in reparations to each individual who had lived through the internment. So when Reagan left office in 1989, he left the nation more unified, more prosperous than he had found it, and at peace, most importantly. Now, within 3 years of his departure, the Soviet Union would collapse and the Cold War would end with a victory for the United States.